This is the CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting tonight from our affiliate WBTV in Charlotte, North Carolina. Good evening. Deepening questions tonight about possible maintenance and human error in the United Airlines DC-10 that crashed Wednesday in Sioux City, Iowa. At least 184 people survived in that crash. At least 109 people died. Against a backdrop of relief and sorrow, investigators are looking especially closely for clues in a suspect engine. Mark Phillips has our report.
Investigators here continue to look at all possible causes of this crash, but they have zeroed in on the plane's tail section, on the number 2 engine mounted there. When that engine was found amid the wreckage, the 6-foot-high fan unit on the front of it was missing, completely gone.
Missing is the whole fan rotor system, including the blades, the disc, and part of the rotor. And this is the first time on this type of engine that we have ever seen that.
The main theory on the cause of the disaster is that the engine fan disintegrated in flight. Pieces of the unit then exploded through the engine casing, puncturing the plane's right stabilizer and severing crucial hydraulic lines. The first close-up views of the wreckage today showed the damage done by the exploding fan pieces, the plane's stabilizer, the severed hydraulic lines.
These blades are the things that we're talking about possibly coming out of the engine and acting like shrapnel as it goes through the side of the case or through the engine.
And investigators have made another unusual discovery around the suspect tail engine.
We have found 2 large nuts in the acoustic panel of the number 2 engine. We don't know where they came from at this time.
The number 2 engine had had major pneumatic cooling system work done on it the day before the crash. While investigators have made no public connection between that work and Wednesday's explosion, aviation experts are asking questions.
Could there have been a human error in the maintenance process that engine last went through? Could someone not have tightened something properly?
Passengers, too, are wondering how this could happen and blaming the airline.
But I do blame someone, because if that plane would have been in good condition, that would not have happened. I don't feel they're taking care of these airplanes right.
A temporary morgue has been set up while the difficult task of identifying victims continues. And more of the survivors left for home today. Their part in the investigation over for now. But the pilot and flight crew are still in the hospital here. They have not yet spoken with investigators. The psychiatrists say they are not ready.
Feeling a great deal of sadness, a great deal of regret, in the sense that they, of course, feel somewhat responsible.
The miracle and the tragedy of United Flight 232. It's now in the hands of investigators. With lawsuits threatened, it's very likely soon to be in the hands of the court. Mark Phillips, CBS News, Sioux City.
8 people were killed and more than 90 injured when a Philippine airliner crashed on landing in Manila today. The plane, with 98 people aboard, was trying to land in a rainstorm. Passengers said it bounced along the runway, then plowed through a concrete wall and across a highway, destroying several cars in its path. The 8 people killed were all trapped and crushed in their cars. In Washington, President Bush today formally sent Congress details of his much-publicized plan for cleaning up the air we breathe, at least by the turn of the century. President Bush insisted his legislation, quote, has teeth. Environmentalists are disappointed and charge it doesn't have nearly enough bite to get the job done. CBS News White House correspondent Leslie Stahl has our report.
The Clean Air Bill is the first White House plan to tighten pollution standards in 10 years, and President Bush turned his announcement into a full-blown Rose Garden ceremony.
This piece of legislation will see to it that every American in every city in America will breathe clean air.
But even before the ceremony, environmentalists and Democrats were criticizing the bill as inadequate.
The president has not asked as much of the American people in this bill as I'm convinced they're prepared to give for cleaner air and better health.
The president's bill would require industry to use the best available technology to reduce toxic and cancer-causing pollutants in the air by 75%, and would require the auto industry to cut tailpipe emissions by almost 40%. But that limit is set as an average per car maker, meaning some cars could actually emit more than the current standard.
Unfortunately, however, it seems that on most motor vehicle issues, the administration chose to listen to GM and not EPA.
The critics say the president watered down his plan by compromising with industry on car emissions, the major contributor to urban smog.
This is a shell game, because if they allow cars to only meet a standard on the average, they're going to have cars polluting more than the standard to try to make up for those who are polluting less.
Environmentalists did praise the president for his plan to clean up acid rain by the end of the century.
This is one of the most aggressive pieces of environmental legislation competing on the Hill.
But overall, the critics charge the bill isn't strong enough to achieve healthy air by the year 2000.
It would allow up to 9 major cities with almost 50 million people in them to continue to breathe dirty air for another 22 years.
White House officials were outraged by the criticism. One accused the environmentalists of pre-positioning for the battle in Congress. Another said simply, they're irresponsible and ignorant. Leslie Stahl, CBS News, the White House.
Still to come on the CBS Evening News tonight from Charlotte, David Martin on a Soviet call for disarmament steps as the Soviet Navy steps out of Norfolk. And Charles Carroll will be along with baby pictures of television news as it heads into middle age.
To the mayor. They've told Mr. O'Dwyer to have the police department halt.
President Bush and his aides warned today that if Congress rejects the B-2 bomber, it will wreck the U.S. bargaining position in arms control talks with Moscow. This is a new tactic in Mr. Bush's battle to get Congress to finance the world's most expensive plane. But as Eric Ingberg reports, it did not appear to turn the tide on Capitol Hill.
The Air Force was so eager for Congress to hear the good news of the maiden flight of the stealth B-2 that it sent the test pilots to Capitol Hill with glowing reports.
I think it's probably a first for a first flight on an airplane to have the systems work that well on first flight.
The test pilots were paraded through congressional meetings and receptions, part of the Air Force effort to overcome price resistance to a $50 billion sales pitch it is making for 132 planes. But the hardest sell came from the top, the commander of the Strategic Air Command and the Air Force Chief of Staff. They said the stakes are nothing less than the future of strategic arms control negotiations, in which the U.S. and Soviets both seem ready to reduce their long-range missile arsenals.
I find it largely inconceivable that we could continue with current negotiating positions without the B-2. In my view, we would simply have to go back to the drawing board.
The generals asserted the new bomber provides a deterrent the U.S. will need if other strategic weapons are reduced in the current START talks. But some Democrats chided them for overselling the plane's importance.
I think it insults the intelligence, both of the Congress and the American people.
Now, it seems to me that that's the kind of leverage or the kind of almost sort of legislative blackmail that raises very significant questions.
Each new B-2 costs $530 million. The kind of figure that gives Congress the aviation version of sticker shock. And the cuts have already started. Sources say one House committee has voted to knock $500 million out of the B-2 program next year. Eric Ingberg, CBS News, Capitol Hill.
A top Soviet military man came to Capitol Hill today calling for steps toward naval disarmament. And his message was underscored by a friendly visit from 3 Russian warships. Our Pentagon correspondent David Martin reports.
You can still get an argument about whether the Cold War is over. But when Soviet warships pull into the home port of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, there's no denying things have changed. And while the cruiser Ustinov and 2 escort ships were tying up in Norfolk, this was happening on Capitol Hill.
Through the years, we have seen many uniforms sit at that table, Marshal Akrameyev, but never one like yours.
The sight of the former chief of the Soviet General Staff, now advisor to Gorbachev, testifying before the House Armed Services Committee was remarkable enough. But listen to what the man who was perhaps the most influential military officer in the Soviet Union said.
I'm personally convinced that neither the United States nor its allies intend today to unleash a warfare against the USSR and its allies.
Akrameyev has probably seen more of the U.S. military than any other Russian. What he saw aboard the aircraft carrier Roosevelt 1 year ago still impresses him.
What's bothering us, though, more than anything else, is your aircraft carrier groups. They're deployed all around the territory of the Soviet Union.
Soviet sailors got to see American warships close up today. Ships Akramayev wants to negotiate out of existence.
I refuse to understand why both of us cannot start the negotiations on cutting our navies. And I think this is the major obstacle on the way of further improvement of our bilateral relationship.
Akramayev is not here to cut any deals. What was going on today in Washington and Norfolk was the chipping away of decades' worth of preconceptions about the other side.
For both countries, it's amazingly important just to have the two navies side by side like this. I never thought I'd see it.
It is a very important step in relations between our two countries for mutual trust and understanding between them. Well, and it's great.
U.S. warships are scheduled to visit a Soviet naval base next month. One more in a growing number of exchanges between two militaries which have spent the last 45 years preparing to obliterate each other. David Martin, CBS News, the Pentagon.
The State Department says it is cooperating with an FBI investigation of a U.S. diplomat suspected of espionage. The innocent until proven guilty subject is Felix Bloch. He's described as a career Foreign Service officer. The State Department says only that he has been placed on leave and his State Department building pass revoked while the investigation proceeds. No details on the charges, but the announcement indicated it involves a, quote, compromise of U.S. security. Responsible for the deadly violence, the police or the protesters? That is the question tonight after an outbreak among Navajo Indians at Window Rock, Arizona. James Hattori reports.
An uneasy calm at the Navajo tribal headquarters after a night of violent protest. Hundreds of Navajos loyal to an ousted tribal chairman clashed with police, then occupied a tribal office for several hours. 2 men died.
There was a lot of blood all over. There was blood all over the place.
Police claim the crowd came at them with clubs. Then someone grabbed one of their pistols and fired at them. Protesters claim the police shot randomly into the crowd.
They fired into the individuals that were fighting with the police.
It was the latest incident in the political struggle for control of the nation's largest Indian tribe.
One of the worst episode in the history of the Navajo Nation.
Navajo leaders suspended tribal chairman Peter McDonald in February after congressional witnesses accused him of taking kickbacks and bribes from companies doing tribal business. Charges are still pending. McDonald, who denies any wrongdoing, wants leaders to reinstate him and may have encouraged the protest, but he says he didn't want the bloodshed.
So it is said that Navajos have to fight Navajos.
It must be a warning to all of us that we must stop this insanity.
The man who temporarily replaced McDonald as chairman says blood is on McDonald's hands.
It is unfortunate that Chairman McDonald has resorted to tactics which are contrary to the customs and tradition of the Navajo people.
Today is a day of mourning in the Navajo Nation. Tomorrow, tribal leaders will face more pressure to bring stability to their government. McDonald predicts that without change, there will be more violence. James Hattori, CBS News, Window Rock, Arizona.
President Bush is insisting on his nomination of William Lucas to head the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. The nomination suffered an embarrassing setback yesterday when Michigan Representative John Conyers withdrew his previous support of Lucas just 1 day after introducing Lucas at a Senate confirmation hearing. Today, President Bush had his chief spokesman say of Lucas, and I quote, "We think he's an excellent candidate." President Bush has rejected a personal appeal from Austrian President Kurt Waldheim to be allowed to come to the United States. White House officials confirmed today that Mr. Bush recently got a handwritten letter from Waldheim pleading to have his name removed from a list of unwanted foreigners. The president turned down the request. A historians commission last year concluded that Waldheim knew of Nazi war crimes and did nothing to stop them. Japanese voters will choose new members of the upper house of Parliament Sunday, and polls indicate the ruling Liberal Democrats could lose control of the House for the first time in more than 30 years. Despite that, Prime Minister Uno is sitting out the last days of the campaign, staying away from women voters who have hounded him over charges that he kept mistresses on his personal payroll. Bill Whitaker reports on the rising power of women in Japan.
These are the most sought-after women in Japan, women voters. After 30 years of governing like an exclusive men's club, Japan's ruling party now finds its fate in the hands of women, unhappy women who could bring down the government of Prime Minister Sosuke Uno.
I think a silent revolution is going on here. It's a kind of social revolution, women waking up and noticing your power.
And flexing their muscle. It was a woman who made Uno's sex life political dynamite, questioning him on the floor of Parliament about his relationship with a geisha, exposing him to criticism and ridicule. And Uno's party wasn't helped any when the wrath of women came down on the Minister of Agriculture, who said women are useless in politics and should go back to the kitchen. But Japanese women are fed up with centuries of traditional male domination. The ruling party calls it the woman problem. Women call it liberation.
All the women are thinking they had to stand up, but no chance. And Uno's scandal is just a good reason. One small chance.
Not too long ago, the subservient geisha was the ideal Japanese woman. Today's geisha might perform the drop kick instead of the tea ceremony. They command ships, sail solo around the world, prepare for space flight. Women are entering the job market like never before, some even breaking into management. Junko Yoda is a vice president at a brokerage firm.
It is male-dominating, but I think things are changing gradually.
Like this new bank near Osaka, run by women, for women, complete with designer dress shop. As for this man, it makes me feel good to have a young lady escort me to the counter, he says. Some things take longer to change than others. But these days, women's focus is on politics. A record number are running for office, most opposed to Uno's ruling party. Uno is praying he can sway the women's vote by Sunday's election. But if he continues to tackle the problem by meeting with women leaders like Miss Japan, there may be little chance. Bill Whitaker, CBS News, Tokyo.
I'll be back in a moment from here in Charlotte with our look at television news at the age of 40. We're broadcasting from Charlotte tonight to help our distinguished affiliate WBTV celebrate its 40th anniversary. 1949, in some ways, seems so long ago that it almost qualifies as ancient history. Harry Truman was president, and we all went to Academy Award-winning movies like All the King's Men in glorious black and white. And when WBTV first signed on the air, almost nobody owned a television set. But one of our own was a young worker at the station then. His name, Charles Carraud. So we've asked Charles to try to help us understand tonight how much television news has changed over 40 years.
CBS Television presents Sunday News with Edward P. Morgan.
Good afternoon.
It was radio with pictures in those days, and in fact, the only picture in this edition of the Sunday News with Edward P. Morgan was that schoolroom picture of George Washington hanging on the wall back there. We hadn't quite mastered set design yet.
CBS News presents Douglas Edwards.
In 1949, the year they signed on there in Charlotte, the CBS Evening News was Douglas Edwards for 15 minutes in black and white. As for pictures, Doug often had to hold them in his hand.
Bonnie Prince Charlie, the future King of England. He's quite a growing boy now, here playing with his little bunny rabbit.
We hadn't really mastered movie coverage of the news yet. We hadn't quite mastered graphics either. Over on NBC, when they wanted to show you a plane crash, they drew one for you. When they wanted to show you a house fire, they built a little house and burned it up.
John Cameron Swayze saying goodnight for Camel cigarettes.
Sponsors were a little more prominent than they are today.
Come away with me, Lucille, in my merry old mobile.
And while Charlotte could see the network news, by the way, San Francisco could not.
Not until 1951, when coaxial cables spanned the continent at last.
Don, will you push a button and bring in the Atlantic coast?
Edward R. Murrow put on a show and tell, linking the New York Harbor and the San Francisco Bay.
We're impressed with the importance of this medium. We shall hope to learn to use it and not to abuse it.
Not long after that, a certain Charlotte kid, having worked at WBTV summer times in his teens, came to work in New York as a writer on Doug Edwards' Evening News. And not long after that, I was reporting for CBS News from Latin America.
2¼ miles up in the Andes, and just 10 years out of the 16th century.
We used to ship our stories to New York in those days. 2 or 3 days later, they might show up in black and white with scratchy sound on the evening news. One summer afternoon, all that suddenly changed.
Go, Europe, go. Hello, North America.
The first communications satellite went up, and Europe and America could send live pictures back and forth across the Atlantic. Europe sent us the Arch of Triumph, the Sistine Chapel, fishermen in Sicily, and reindeer in Lapland.
We have quite a few mosquitoes up here.
We sent them Niagara Falls, Mount Rushmore, a Kennedy press conference, and a Cubs-Phillies game from Wrigley Field.
Let's give all the baseball fans in Europe a big hello from Chicago.
About then, the milestones on the highway of television news started flying by. The first half-hour evening news, Walter Cronkite in 1963. In 1965, suddenly, you could see what color tie Walter was wearing if you had a color television set, which hardly anybody had yet. Television news really did begin to provide a national hearth. This is what we could do that newspapers couldn't. We could take you there and let you see for yourself what happened.
Another night of living dangerously is over for the hunger strikers here in Tiananmen Square.
As Murrow said way back there, we are impressed by this medium. We're still trying to learn to use it and not abuse it.
Roll and take it.
And that's tonight's CBS Evening News. Dan Rather reporting from warm and friendly Charlotte, North Carolina. Bob Schieffer will have the news for you tomorrow night. I'll see you Monday. Good night.
This is CBS.